Gemini, take a deep breath and settle in, because what's coming through in this reading carries the energy of transformation. Quiet miracles, unexpected blessings. This may be the moment everything begins to turn around. There is a word I want to use at the outset, and I want to be honest with you about why I'm hesitating before I use it. The word is becoming. And the reason I'm hesitating is that it is a word that has been used so much in certain contexts, in certain kinds of language that surrounds growth and self-development and change, that it has accumulated a kind of residue, a gloss of insincerity that is not the word's fault, but that makes it harder to use cleanly. Because the word itself, stripped of that residue, stripped of its associations with workshops and journals and the motivational language of incremental improvement, points at something genuinely important, something I think you are in the middle of, and something I want to examine with you carefully, because I think it deserves examination that is honest rather than simply enthusiastic. What I mean by becoming, the specific sense in which I want to use it today, is not the performance of changing. It is not the acquisition of new habits or the adoption of new frameworks for thinking about yourself. Those things can be real, and they can be useful, but they are not what I mean. What I mean is something quieter and more fundamental. The process by which a person gradually comes into alignment with something that was already true about them. The closing of a gap that has perhaps been present for a long time between who a person actually is, at whatever level of depth you want to locate the self, and how they have been living, what they have been allowing, what they have been asking of the world and of themselves. That gap, and I want to be specific about what I mean by it, because vagueness here would not serve you. That gap tends to originate in the ways we adapt, in the ways we respond to the early evidence of our lives by concluding certain things about what is and is not appropriate to want, to ask for, to expect, to be. Those conclusions are not random. They are, usually, intelligent responses to real circumstances. A person who learns early that certain expressions of themselves produce difficult responses from the people they depend on will reasonably, intelligently adapt, will learn to manage the expression, will learn to route certain impulses elsewhere, or to contain them, or to deprioritize the parts of themselves that seem to generate friction with the world as they encounter it. That adaptation is, in the moment it happens, a kind of wisdom. It is the wisdom of someone learning to function in a particular environment. What I want to examine honestly is what happens to that adaptation over time. Because the adaptation that was once responsive to a real situation has a tendency to persist well past the situation that produced it. It becomes part of the operating structure, part of what feels normal, and therefore part of what does not get examined. And what does not get examined continues to operate even when the original conditions that justified it are long gone. What I am feeling in your energy, and I want to say this carefully and specifically, rather than in the general language of positive readings, is the beginning of an examination. Not a dramatic one, not a crisis-level one. The gentle, almost imperceptible beginning of a process by which certain things that had been accepted as simply how things are beginning to be recognized as conclusions, as choices that were once made and that have been lived with so long they stopped feeling like choices. The recognition is important, not because it immediately changes anything, but because it is the genuine precondition for change of the non-performed, actually real variety. You cannot alter a conclusion you do not know you have drawn. The first movement is always the noticing. Let me be more specific, because I think specificity is what makes this kind of reading actually useful, rather than simply atmospheric. What I sense most clearly is a particular kind of noticing that is happening in the area of what you have been allowing yourself to want. Not surface-level wanting, not the daily operational wanting of the specific outcomes you are working toward. I mean the deeper register of wanting. The layer where a person holds their real sense of what their life could be, what they genuinely hope for in the structural sense, what they would describe if someone asked them, not what they are working on, but what they are working toward. What they are, at some level that is below the management of daily life, actually orienting their life in the direction of. There is, I think, a quality in your experience right now of that layer beginning to become more audible. And the reason I want to name that specifically is that it is not always a comfortable thing. When something that has been quiet for a long time gets louder, the first response is not always clarity. Sometimes the first response is a kind of discomfort, an unsettledness, a sense that something is shifting that you have not yet fully identified. If you have been experiencing something like that, a formless kind of restlessness, a sense that something is out of alignment without being entirely certain what it is, I want to say that the discomfort is not a problem. It is the sound of something real beginning to move. I want to speak now about patience, but I want to speak about it honestly, because patience is another word that has accumulated residue. It is often used to mean endurance, to mean the managing of wanting in the face of not yet having, the gritting of teeth and the continuing forward. That is one thing, and sometimes it is necessary. But there is a different quality of patience that I think is more relevant to where you actually are, and it is worth distinguishing between them, because they feel different from the inside, and they have different effects on the situation they are being applied to. The patience that is endurance is organized around waiting, around holding on. It has a quality of tension in it, a compressed attention facing a particular direction, watching for the arrival of what is being waited for. That quality of attention, of compressed watching, has its own effects on a situation. It creates a kind of pressure. And pressure, depending on the nature of what it is being applied to, does not always accelerate. Sometimes it constricts. Sometimes it creates exactly the interference that makes what you are watching for harder to perceive as it approaches from the angle you were not watching. The other kind of patience, the one I want to name as what I think is actually being asked of you right now, is not organized around waiting at all. It is organized around presence, around the quality of being genuinely in your actual life, with the actual texture of your actual days, rather than in the imagined future version of your life where the thing you want has arrived. This distinction matters more than it might initially appear to, because the version of your life that has the capacity to receive what you are moving toward does not exist in the future. It exists in the present. It is being built, or not, by the quality of attention you are bringing to your actual existing life right now. A person who is living in the future of their life, who is orienting their attention primarily toward the not yet arrived version of things, is not fully inhabiting the version of their life where the not yet arrived things will, in fact, arrive. There is a kind of readiness that only exists in presence. And that presence is what I am encouraging when I use the word patience in this specific sense. Something I want to address directly, because I think not addressing it would be a kind of omission. There is often, in readings of this kind, an implicit message that the discomfort a person is experiencing is primarily a signal of the proximity of good things. That the restlessness, the sense of things shifting, the difficulty of the particular chapter a person finds themselves in, is essentially a previewing of the better chapter that is coming. I want to be careful about delivering that message too cleanly because I think it is sometimes true and sometimes a way of making discomfort feel more tolerable by locating its resolution outside of the discomfort itself. And what I actually believe is that the resolution is not located outside the discomfort. It is located inside the full inhabiting of it. What I mean by that is this. The things that are genuinely moving in your life, the real shifts in the real conditions of your actual situation, are not going to arrive as relief from the difficulty you are experiencing. They are going to arrive as part of the continued experiencing of your actual life. And the quality of the arriving will depend in part on how fully you are present for the chapter that immediately precedes the arrival. Not because you have to earn it through suffering. The universe is not that transactional. But because presence is the mechanism. The full inhabiting of where you actually are is what builds the specific version of you that the things you are moving toward will recognize and find and be able to reach. Let me speak now about the particular texture of change that I think is actually occurring, rather than the kind of change that is most dramatic in the way it presents itself. Because change in real lives does not usually arrive as transformation. The word transformation implies a before and an after, with a clear boundary between them. A butterfly is genuinely transformed from a caterpillar in a way that is legible and complete and visible. Human change is almost never like that. Human change is usually more like the gradual turning of a ship. The direction changes, and it changes significantly. And over time, the difference in where you end up compared to where you would have ended up is vast. But in the moment of the turning, the change is almost imperceptible. The ship does not leap. It adjusts its heading, and the adjustment is real, and its consequences are enormous. But they are enormously gradual in their revelation. What I am feeling in your situation is the adjusting of the heading, not the arriving at the new destination, though the destination is real and the movement toward it is real. The beginning of a reorientation whose consequences will become legible over time, and whose full significance will only be visible looking backward from a future position. I think it's worth saying this explicitly because it manages a specific kind of expectation. If you are waiting to feel transformed, to feel the clear before and after quality of a genuine change having occurred, you may miss the actual change that is happening in the quiet, continuous adjustment of your daily orientation. The change is not an event. It is a turning, and the turning is already in progress. There is something I want to examine about the relationship between patience and worthiness, because I think they get entangled in ways that are worth separating out. There is a version of the patience and good things narrative that implies that a person is waiting for something they deserve, and that the waiting is the proving of the deserving, that the length and difficulty of the waiting is somehow proportionate to the magnitude of what is coming. I want to be careful about that narrative because I think it is often more harmful than helpful. Not because there is no relationship between what a person builds in themselves and what becomes available to them. There is a genuine relationship. But because framing that relationship as deserving and reward introduces a quality of judgment into the situation that is not, I think, the most accurate or the most useful way to understand what is actually happening. What is actually happening is less moralistic and more structural. When certain conditions are present in a person's life and in a person's interior experience of their life, certain things become possible that were not possible when those conditions were absent. Not because the person has earned those things through the quality of their waiting, but because the conditions for their arrival are genuinely different. A seed does not earn the spring, but the spring is genuinely necessary for the seed to become what it is capable of becoming. The waiting is not the earning of spring. The waiting is the holding of the conditions that allow the spring to do what spring does. There is something worth sitting with in that distinction. Now I want to speak about what I think is the specific quality of your readiness right now. Because I think readiness is a more precise and more useful word than worthiness for what I am actually sensing. And I want to be honest about what readiness means in the practical sense rather than in the inspirational sense, because in the practical sense, it is a more interesting and more complex thing. Readiness, in the sense I mean, is not preparedness. It is not having everything in place, having resolved all the outstanding things, having achieved a certain level of stability or clarity or organization that then licenses the arrival of what you want. That version of readiness is actually a form of delay, because there is always more to resolve, always more to prepare, and the condition of having everything ready before the wanting of real things is permitted is a condition that is perpetually receding. The readiness I am talking about is something else. It is a quality of openness, a quality of not gripping, a quality that I want to try to describe accurately rather than just pointing at it with words that sound right. The readiness I am sensing in you is something like having set down a particular kind of weight. Not having solved the things the weight was attached to, not having resolved the situations that produced the weight, but having, in some way that is more felt than decided, stopped organizing yourself primarily around the carrying of it. There is a release that has happened, or is happening, that is not the release of the circumstances. The circumstances may still be what they are. The release is the release of a particular orientation toward the circumstances. The release of the conclusion that the circumstances are the final word on what is possible. And that release, which is a genuine internal event, even when the external situation has not yet changed, genuinely changes what the external situation is capable of producing next. I want to be careful here, because I am aware that what I have just described can sound like spiritual bypassing. Like the suggestion that a person simply needs to change their attitude about their circumstances, and their circumstances will change. I do not mean that, and I want to be clear about why. Attitude change as a mechanism of circumstance change is both true and overstated. It is true in the genuine sense that how a person relates to their circumstances affects what they notice, what they reach for, what they make available to the people around them, what they allow themselves to attempt. Those are real effects. They are not magical effects. They are the practical consequences of a different internal orientation on the actual behaviors and perceptions that constitute a life. But they are not unlimited. They do not override structural conditions. They do not make unjust things just or difficult things easy. What they do is adjust what is possible within the real conditions of a real life. And adjusting what is possible within real conditions is not a small thing, even if it is also not an infinite thing. What I want to say to you is this. Within the real conditions of your actual life, which have their genuine difficulties and their genuine constraints and their genuine areas of uncertainty, there is more available than your adapted, protected, intelligently defensive model of what is available has been allowing you to perceive. That more is real. It is not everything you want, and it is not the resolution of everything that has been difficult. It is a genuine expansion of what is actually possible for you in the conditions you are actually in. And the readiness I am sensing is the beginning of the capacity to see that expansion. To notice what is available without immediately filtering it through the conclusions about availability that your experience had produced. Let me speak now about what that looks like practically. Because I think one of the risks of readings of this kind is that they remain at a level of abstraction that is emotionally resonant but operationally unclear. And operational clarity, I think, is what makes this kind of language actually useful rather than simply comforting. What the expansion of what is available tends to look like in a real life, in a real period, is not usually the sudden arrival of large dramatic things. It tends to look like a gradual increase in the number of small moments that feel genuinely inhabited rather than endured. A gradual increase in the frequency of interactions that feel real rather than managed. A gradual widening of the range of things you allow yourself to pursue, to ask for, to invest in, because the internal cost of attempting has decreased. Because the assumption that attempt leads primarily to disappointment has, quietly, loosened its grip. And those small things compound. They accumulate in the texture of a life in ways that eventually add up to something that looks, from the outside, and feels, from the inside, like a genuinely different kind of life. But the granularity of the change is small and continuous, not large and sudden. The specific practical guidance I want to offer from this is pay attention to the small moments. Not with the anxious attention of someone watching for confirmation that things are improving. With the genuine, unhurried attention of someone who has decided to actually be present in their life, rather than managing it from a slight distance. The small moments are where the actual living happens. The large events are important, but they are surrounded by and embedded in the texture of ordinary days. And it is in the ordinary days that the quality of a life is actually experienced. A person can have remarkable things happen to them and experience very little of them if their habitual orientation is to be somewhere other than fully present. And a person can have a life that contains, from the outside, relatively modest material and experience it with a quality of richness and presence that makes it genuinely nourishing. I am not suggesting that your life needs to remain modest. What I am sensing is that it will not. But I am suggesting that the fullness of what arrives in the larger events will be experienced in proportion to the quality of presence you are building in the smaller ones. The practice of genuine presence is not preparation for your real life. It is your real life. This chapter, right now, with its difficulty and its uncertainty and its early unfolding of something new, is your real life, not the prologue to it. There is something I want to name about the particular challenge of this specific kind of chapter. The chapter that is characterized by things beginning to shift, by new conditions beginning to form, by the early stages of a genuinely different period, is paradoxically one of the harder ones to fully inhabit. Because the newness is not yet established. The difficulty of the previous chapter is receding, but not yet gone. There is a quality of in-betweenness that is genuinely uncomfortable, not because it contains nothing good. It often contains the first real evidence of the good things forming, but because it is undefined, because it does not yet have the legible shape of the better chapter it is becoming. There is a human tendency, a very understandable one, to want to rush through that in-between quality, to push toward the clarity of the established new chapter rather than remaining in the ambiguity of the transition. And that rushing, when it happens, tends to have a subtle effect on the quality of what gets built. The things that are forming in this transition period are forming in a specific way that is related to the specific conditions of this specific time. Rushing through the conditions does not accelerate the formation. It sometimes disrupts it. The ambiguity is, in some sense, necessary. Not indefinitely, not forever, but for this period, the not yet having the final shape, quality of things, is part of how the shape is being found. And there is a genuine form of courage in staying present with that, rather than reaching for premature definition. Let me now speak to what I sense is the thing that is genuinely, really, newly possible for you. Because I think after this much examination and this much context setting, you deserve specificity about what I actually feel, rather than more framing. What I sense most clearly is the possibility, genuinely new in quality, of a relationship with your own desires that is less managed. What I mean by that is this: a person who has learned to be careful about what they want, careful in the sense of containing the wanting within what is considered reasonable to expect, does not stop wanting. The wanting does not disappear. It goes somewhere else. It becomes the persistent background quality of a life that is being managed around a set of core needs that are not fully acknowledged, because the acknowledgement would produce the vulnerability of the genuine desire being seen and potentially going unmet again. The managing of wanting is a very intelligent and very costly adaptation. Intelligent because it genuinely reduces certain kinds of acute pain. Costly because it also reduces certain kinds of acute aliveness. And the aliveness and the pain are not, usually, separable. The same openness that makes the wanting of real things possible also makes the disappointment of real things possible. A managed life is a less painful life in some respects, and a less alive life in others. That is not a judgment. It is just the honest description of the trade. What I sense becoming newly possible for you is a different relationship to that trade. Not the abandonment of all protection, not the naive openness of someone who has not yet encountered real disappointment, but a more conscious and more chosen relationship to the question of how much life to let in. A willingness to let the wanting be more audible, to acknowledge what is genuinely wanted, including in the areas where the evidence of the past most clearly suggests that wanting it has led to difficulty. Because the conditions have changed, and the model of what is available that was built from the evidence of the past is not an accurate model of what is available now. And there is a new evidence base that is being built if you are willing to allow the wanting to be present enough to orient your actual behavior in the world. That shift from a managed relationship with desire to a more genuinely inhabited one is, I think, the heart of what is actually happening in your life right now. Everything else I have said is context for this: the noticing of your own conclusions, the quality of readiness I described, the heading adjustment rather than transformation. All of those are aspects of this same central movement, the gradual permission to want what you actually want, in the areas where that wanting has felt most dangerous, most likely to go unmet, most in need of management. I want to say something about the people in your life, because a shift of this kind does not happen in isolation. And I want to acknowledge that. The people who are genuinely good for where you are going, and you have a sense of who those people are, even if you have not fully articulated it to yourself, are not the people who will require you to manage yourself in order to be in relationship with them. They are the people in whose presence the management is not necessary, who receive what you actually are with a quality of genuine recognition rather than a quality of tolerance. There are probably fewer of those people in your life right now than there will be in a year. Not because you will push people away, but because as you become more genuinely yourself, less managed, more inhabited, you become a different kind of attractor. You call toward you a different quality of connection. And some of the connections that exist now that were calibrated to the managed version of you will naturally shift in their importance. not through conflict or rupture necessarily, but through the simple organic process of finding that what you have to offer and what a particular person is equipped to receive are less well matched than they once appeared to be. That is not a loss you should try to prevent. It is an accurate sorting that is part of what the becoming produces. The people who are genuinely resonant with who you are becoming will become more visible as you become more genuinely yourself. But that visibility requires the genuineness. It requires the risk of being more fully what you are. I want to speak now about what I think is the most common way this particular kind of moment gets missed. Because I think there is a genuine risk in the specific situation I am describing, and I would rather name it directly than allow it to be a hidden obstacle. The risk is this: the first genuinely inhabited wanting, the first real desire that gets acknowledged rather than managed, will probably be in an area where the history of disappointment is most vivid. And the most vivid histories of disappointment tend to produce the most vigorous protective responses. So the moment in which the wanting becomes most audible is also the moment at which the protective response, the management, the containing of expectation is most activated. The wanting and the defense against the wanting tend to arrive together. And the question of which of them gets more of your attention, more of your trust, more of your behavioral response in that specific moment is the question that matters most. What I want to say about that is the defense is intelligent. The defense is not the enemy. The defense has served real purposes, and it should be respected as a part of your history. But it is not the final word on what is available. And you know that in some deep way that is not always fully accessible to the surface level of cognition. You know that. And when you know it, when the quiet knowing is accessible, the question is whether you are willing to act from it rather than from the protection. Not recklessly, not without the full acknowledgement of the risk, but with the genuine, chosen, eyes open willingness to let the wanting be real and to take a genuinely inhabited step in the direction of what you actually want. That step, and I mean this very precisely, one actual step, not a transformation, not a complete overhaul of your relationship with vulnerability. One genuine step in one specific area where the wanting has been most managed. That step is what I am pointing at when I speak about what is genuinely available to you in this period. It is not the magical resolution of the history. It is one real move that changes the evidence base, that gives the part of you that has been accumulating evidence for the necessity of the defense a different data point to work with. One step, genuinely inhabited, genuinely risky in the specific sense of allowing what you want to be visible and real, is the thing. Now, I want to be honest about what comes after that step, because I think honesty here is more useful than the narrative that a single genuine move produces immediate transformation. What comes after that step is usually more of the same texture as the step itself. It is not usually a sudden flowering of everything you hoped for. The world takes a moment to calibrate to the new information about what you are making available. Other people, situations, circumstances take time to respond to the changed signal. And there is a window often between the genuine move and the response to the genuine move that requires holding, that requires not immediately concluding that the move was wrong because the immediate response was not the validation you were hoping for. The holding in that window, the staying genuine without the immediate confirmation, is perhaps the hardest part of the whole sequence I am describing, and it is the part that most often does not get held. What allows the holding is, I think, not courage in the heroic sense. It is something quieter and more available. It is the quality of genuine self-trust. Not confidence, which is a different thing. Self-trust in the specific sense of a person who has developed enough relationship with their own interior experience to be able to tell the difference between the signal of genuine misalignment and the noise of the protective response's alarm. Who knows at a sufficient depth of self-knowledge when what they are feeling is a genuine signal that something is wrong versus the habituated fear response that exists independently of whether anything is actually wrong. That discrimination is learnable. It develops through practice and through the accumulation of evidence about which of your internal voices has historically been more accurate. And I think you have more of it than you are currently giving yourself credit for. Let me speak toward a close now, and I want to do it in a way that does not undermine what I have spent this reading building. The temptation in the closing of a reading of this kind is to resolve it, to bring everything to a clear, warm endpoint that sends you out feeling settled and certain and confirmed. I am resistant to that temptation because I think the unsettledness of this period, the quality of being in genuine transition, of having the heading changed without yet having the new destination fully in view, is real and deserves to be met as real rather than managed away by the resolution of the reading. What I want to leave you with is not resolution. It is recognition. The recognition that the specific discomfort of where you are right now is not a sign that something is wrong. It is, in the most accurate reading I can offer of your situation, a sign that something is right. That the movement that is occurring, the genuine internal shift toward a less managed and more inhabited relationship with your own desires and your own possibilities, is exactly the movement that this period of your life is for. Not in a destined or predetermined sense. In the sense that this is where you genuinely are. And where you genuinely are is always, in some sense, the right place from which to take the next step. Because it is the only place from which any step is actually possible. The becoming that is occurring is real. It is not a performance of growth, and it does not require the performance of growth in order to count. The gradual closing of the gap between who you actually are and how you have been living is real work, even when it looks from the outside like nothing in particular is happening, even when it does not feel, from the inside, like the dramatic transformation that the word becoming might imply. The ship is turning. The heading is different. And the destination that the new heading makes possible is genuinely different from the destination the old heading was taking you to. That is enough. That is, in fact, more than enough. Go forward into your days not with the expectation of immediate confirmation, and not with the managed absence of expectation, but with the genuine, grounded, fully in your actual life quality of someone who has begun, really begun, to let themselves be known. To the world, yes, but first and most importantly, to themselves. That is the becoming. That is what is actually happening. And it is worth being genuinely, unhurriedly, carefully present for. Not because of what it leads to, because of what it actually is.